This week, the Reverend Eugene Downing of New Hope Baptist Church and I attended the New Baptist Covenant Gathering in Atlanta, Georgia, with other Baptist clergy from around the country who are committed to bridging the centuries-old divides of systemic racism in our cities by bringing African American and Euro-American peoples together, primarily within our own congregations. This is long, hard, and painful work. And sometimes the only thing we have to hold us together is our stories. Yes, our story is important, and we can learn from everybody's story. It seems simple enough, but so often we assume our story is the full story, and it so rarely is. So I want to share with you a story that I heard this week. So the similarities of First Baptist Church of Macon, Georgia, and First Baptist Church of Christ of Macon, Georgia, are striking. The elegant planked wood ceilings, the majestic pipe organs, the grand chancels. Original 19th century wooden pews have a patina in both churches that only comes from generations of people sitting through countless sermons. But these two churches don't just share a name and an architect. They also share a history that is not uncommon in the South, yet it is little discussed. Before the Civil War, they were one congregation under one roof, though segregated by race in the pews. They later split into separate, segregated churches altogether. First Baptist Church became the predominantly black church, and First Baptist Church of Christ became the predominantly white one. And today, they are only separated by a grassy lawn. African American worshipers say white worshipers forced the split. Whites say black worshipers chose to separate. Slave owners were simply honoring the enslaved's desire for autonomy, or so the story went for generations at the white church. Both pastors admitted it wasn't just that we had different versions of our history, but that neither one was complete without the other. And so these dueling narratives kind of went on in silos in the two congregations until they sat down together a couple of years ago to discuss their history. And this is what they learned. In 1826, Macon's wealthiest planters, bankers, and businessmen chartered First Baptist Church of Christ. And each man in the congregation owned between 8 to 20 enslaved people. When the original church was constructed, almost certainly by enslaved men, a section was designated for them. Again, this arrangement was not uncommon in the South, particularly after the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion in 1831, when there were laws enacted that barred black people from assembling without white supervision. By the 1840s, black people outnumbered whites 2-1 at First Baptist, and so guess what? In 1845, a new building was constructed for the black churchgoers, but with certain provisions, of course. They had to be supervised by a white pastor. They couldn't have their own pastor, and so the white pastor from their former church would come over after their service to preach and give the sacraments. One person from the white church today said, our story at First Baptist Church of Christ was that we built the black church for them, that we were good people who did good things, but that, we've come to find out, is not an accurate description. As they began looking through their church archives, they discovered that around 1855, their church ledgers show that a widow of one of their members sold 2 teenaged boys, each for $950, which would be about $46,000 in today's money. And they can tell from the ledger that after these boys were sold, the widow turned around and gave that money to the church. And the next day, the church paid the pastor. What they discovered, you see, was that the money from the sale of these teenagers was literally used to pay the salary of the white pastor. And as my friend Scott, who now pastors the white church, said, it was horrendous to think about the fact that these two young boys were former members of our church when we were one church together. We sold our own members, he said. The day that he preached a sermon about this in his church, there was an audible gasp in the congregation. And afterward, he had members coming up to him saying, we do not tell this story, and we need to. We have to start telling this story, and we have to do something about this. And so now, nearly 200 years since the formation of the original church, the people of both congregations are confronting the long legacy of slavery and segregation and how it has shaped their houses of worship. The two pastors honestly shared with us about all of the mistrust and skepticism there is in this process, but that they are choosing to hold this tension and not run from it. They're forming a partnership that includes, first and foremost, relationship building, listening to one another's stories. And in a moment of revealing the truth about who they each are, they're recognizing they have a shared history. But no matter how horrific parts of their shared history have been, they want to work towards healing and moving forward together. It doesn't happen with one meal or one conversation, but they do know that it begins with how they tell their story. And they're hopeful for a fresh start. Not a fresh start that forgets their history, but one that preserves all the voices of their history. How we tell our story matters. What details we include and what details we omit, whose voices we lift up and whose voices we silence. Does our story keep us stuck in the past? Or does it honestly honor our past while allowing us to move forward? Well, Joseph's story is remembered and passed down in the book of Genesis. And short of having a whole book named after him, like Ruth or Jonah or Job, Joseph does pretty well. He gets 14 chapters, Genesis 37 through 50. And today we meet him in chapters 44 to 45 at what would be called, in literary terms, the denouement, or the climax of this long chain of events when all of a sudden something is decided or made clear. All of the tension in this Joseph story has been building to this moment, and what will happen in this moment will dictate how the future unfolds. If you know your Bible, you know this moment well, right? The moment of revealing and of recognition, when Joseph stops hiding and reveals himself to his brothers, and when his brothers come close enough to recognize him, to see him for who he really is. Now, many call this a moment of reconciliation. There are tears flowing and hugs all around, after all. But just as with years of hurt history in the two First Baptist churches of Macon, Georgia, reconciliation really can't happen that quickly. It takes years to reconcile or restore broken relationships. The brothers' embrace is just the beginning of this fresh start. But before we get there, just a quick review, in case you don't know, of all the stuff that's happened in the past. And this is going to be quick, so if you don't know the story, I apologize. You have some afternoon reading for you. But basically, Joseph is the youngest of 12 boys. Their dad is Jacob, and for whatever reason, Jacob favors Joseph. He gives him a pretty coat of many colors. Joseph tends to tattletale on his older brothers, and he has these dreams, and he tells his brothers about them, where his brothers are bowing down to him in the future, and Joseph is sort of above them, superior. Well, this makes the brothers mad, and so one day they decide to throw him in a pit and leave him there to die. But Judah has an ounce of compassion and instead says, well, why don't we just sell him? Now, we're supposed to feel good about this option, but some would argue that death would have been better than slavery or human trafficking. Nonetheless, Joseph is sold, and his brothers rub animal blood on his pretty coat. They return home to their dad and say he was killed by animals. Meanwhile, Joseph is taken to Egypt to work for Pharaoh. And believe it or not, he starts as a lowly slave, but then works his way up to kind of be above all the other slaves. At some point, Pharaoh's wife, Potiphar, accuses him of making advances toward her. He denies them, but nonetheless, he's thrown in prison. And in prison, he starts impressing people with his dream interpretation skills, particularly Pharaoh. And basically, Joseph says, you need to start storing up your food because there's 7 years of plenty now, but 7 years of famine are coming, and we want to have enough. And so basically, Pharaoh makes Joseph his secretary of agriculture, you could say. He has all the power over who gets what food and what to do with it. Now, back home in Canaan, people are starving. And so Dad, Jacob, sends his sons to Egypt to buy some of this grain that has been stored up. And when they arrive in Egypt, they see Joseph. And he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. Probably because it's been years, he's speaking a different language, and I'm sure they never thought in their wildest dreams that he would be anything but a slave. Joseph, liking this power he has over his brothers and no doubt feeling resentment about being sold, chooses not to reveal his identity to his brothers. Instead, he accuses them of spying, throws them in jail for 3 days, takes them out of jail and says, okay, you can go home, but you need to bring the youngest brother, the new youngest brother, Benjamin, with you. And I'm just going to hold Simeon in jail while you go do that, just in case. To his credit, Joseph does give some grain to the brothers as they make their way back. Of course, the father, Jacob, does not want to send Benjamin, the youngest son. He can't bear to lose another one. But the food runs out. The famine is severe enough that the father relents, and he sends all the sons back to Egypt with Benjamin. Joseph shares a meal with them, and from time to time he runs off and he cries because he can't take the surge of emotions that he's feeling within him, but he's hiding all of that from his brothers. They still don't know who he is. And then we come to today's story where Joseph instructs his servants to slip a silver cup in Benjamin's sack. And as they head home, he has his people run after them and say, wait, you stole the silver cup. And they look in Benjamin's backpack, and there it is. Now the brothers beg Joseph to release Benjamin. Judah even says, I'll stay in prison in his place, but it will absolutely kill my father if we don't return home with Benjamin. And it's at this moment that Joseph chooses to reveal himself to his brothers. Seeing that his brothers are shocked, he invites them to come closer, and he shares his version of this whole story with them about how they sold him into slavery, etc. But he assures them that this was all part of God's plan and it's okay. Interestingly, Joseph never forgives his brothers. Instead, he sees their behavior as not of their own doing. It was not you who sent me here, but God, he says. Joseph's interpreting his story in such a way that he removes blame from his brothers and perhaps more importantly from himself. He puts everything on God, as if that explanation makes almost murder, slavery, lying, revenge, unlawfully imprisoning, holding hostage, blackmailing, and planting evidence all okay. Now, personally, I don't believe that this explanation by Joseph tells us much of anything about how God works in the world, except that God can work in and through any situation, no matter how twisted or horrific. Rather, I think Joseph's theological explanation tells us more about what's going on in Joseph's own head. Maybe he doesn't want to believe the pain that he felt when his brothers almost killed him and sold him. And we can probably have no doubt that he doesn't want his brothers to hold him accountable for being so mean to them over the years. They were starving, mind you, when he was playing all these tricks on them. In any case, after Joseph says his bit, he hugs all of his brothers. They share tears. It's a kumbaya moment. And no matter their initial intentions or motivations, no matter their reservations or any theologizing of the moment, the brothers are reunited. And from here on out, they're together with their dad. And they survive the years of famine, and they're able to bury their father together when the time comes. Now, there are so many takeaways from this story. But the one that I want you to think about today is this: storytelling and listening is key to the gospel work of reconciliation. The only way Joseph gets to this moment in the story, this moment of revealing himself, is by listening, finally listening to his brothers. He finally hears how dire things are and how utterly distraught and grieved his father is. And his concern for the father is really the linchpin in this text. You know, they've been saying this all along, but Joseph's been ignoring it or not hearing it, and finally he does, and it hits him in the gut. So he drops the mask, he lets go of his power, he's vulnerable, and he says, "Here I am, your brother." Now, they can't recognize him, so he invites them to come even closer. And as he shares his story with them, they listen to him, and they recognize him. You see, it's only after these moments of revelation and recognition that reconciliation can even begin to be a possibility. The text tells us that they talked for a while. And even if forgiveness wasn't had in that moment, they connected in such a way that they could acknowledge this: yes, a lot of stuff happened in our past, and a fresh start is possible. See, in both the Joseph story and the story of the two First Baptist churches of Macon, Georgia, telling their stories and listening to each other led them to get to a place where they could say, yes, all of this happened in our past to break us apart and keep us apart, and we can still have a future together. This is the good news of the gospel. As we begin this new set of spiritual practices in our Yes and series of storytelling and listening, I invite you to think about the stories in your own past that need telling. If to no one else even but yourself, maybe. And I invite you to listen to what others around you are sharing too. Ask yourself, are there voices that I'm not hearing that I should be? Are there people I can seek out, even in this church, to hear more about their stories? There are stories hidden between the lines of ordinary comments every day. Often it just takes us saying something simple like, "Tell me more about that," when someone makes an offhand comment. You know, there really are no offhand comments. There's often a world of truth behind those statements. We could probably all start this work with our own families, right? Brothers, sisters, children, parents, things in our past that we need to heal from in order to move forward into our future. Harboring grudges and ill will and spite and hurt and blame is a sure way to limit our futures. Yes, you can forgive others, and you can still keep remembering what happened so that it's not just swept under the rug. Again, think about those two First Baptist churches of Macon, Georgia. They're not sweeping anything under the rug. They're holding it out in the open now. Think of Joseph and his brothers. They're finally coming clean about their past so they can move forward. Fresh starts are possible, and that's the meaning of grace. And I just leave this final thought with you that, many times the stories that need to be told aren't bad ones. Maybe they're just behind the scenes themselves. As we move into this stewardship season at Calvary, we move into a time where we celebrate our collective story as a church. We take an inventory of the past year and we dream about the future for next year. And as we prepare to think about our financial commitments, I invite you to share the stories you witness each and every day in and around Calvary that often do not get told. Our collective story is only as strong as our individual ones, just as our collective giving is only as strong as our individual giving. Yes, your story here at Calvary is important, and you can learn from everyone else's story here too. All kinds of stuff has happened in our church's past that makes us who we are today. And the gospel truth is that a fresh start is always possible for us as we listen to the God who is calling us to ministry beyond what we could even imagine for ourselves. What fresh start do you want for yourself, for our church? We are, after all, co-authors with God. What will our next chapter be? Amen.